Do you have a burning urge to write fantasy? Well, I did, and I do. And I thought I'd share those tips with you. Writing fantasy, an imp's journey. Hello, and welcome to the Bottled Imp, exploring the realms of fantasy. My name is Ken Boyter, and today we're going to do something slightly different. We thought it'd be good to share with you my journey of writing a book. So this is going to be like hints, tips and advice on how to speak. Not how to speak, how to write. And specifically writing fantasy, because I have written a book called The Legends of Grimace Ironblood. And I'm no expert in writing. This is my first foray into publishing. Now I've decided to self-publish. And I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of share that journey with you, because I'm going to take you right from how do you get ideas and inspiration and why should you write, all the way through to getting your book printed and published, and also the tricky end if you're self-publishing like me, the marketing. How are you going to sell your book? So as I say, I'm no expert. I just thought it'd be nice to share the journey, which is why I've called it Writing Fantasy, an Imp's Journey. Now, it's not going to replace the regular Friday show. We're still going to do lots of reviews of board games, films, books, etc., and eventually other types of shows. This is just going to be coming out as and when. So we hope you enjoy it. Anyway, let's start where all good stories start, and that's at the beginning. Writing fantasy. Well, the big question that I always ask myself is, why do I write? What's the point? Why am I writing? Now, if you think you're going to be writing for fame and money, well, that's not necessarily the best answer to give. I started writing way back. Probably the earliest thing I remember writing are little short stories when I was at primary school. In fact, I found a whole bunch of them in the loft the other day, and you know, they were really cute. I really enjoyed them, and it brought loads of happy memories back for me. And I do remember writing lots of things at school, and really love the sort of creative aspect of writing a story, just something that comes from nowhere and then it ends up on the page, and hopefully somebody reads it and they enjoy it. So that to me is the main motivation. If you think that you're going to write the next bestseller and you're going to make loads of money and going to be famous, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the odds of that are very slim. But that shouldn't put you off. You should be writing because you love writing and it makes you happy. Because I find it very satisfying, and I find it's its own reward, just that aspect of being creative. So therefore, I would just ask, what are your motivations for writing? And to me, it's to be happy. So that then leads on to the next question, where to start? What should you be writing about? Now, there is that old saying, write what you know. And I remember thinking, well, okay, I know about school. Fair enough. But I remember thinking, I don't really want to write about my humdrum life. Now, there are people out there that have written very well and very entertaining and very profound stories about everyday things. Alan Bennett springs to mind. But to me, that's not me. That isn't what I particularly want to write about. And I think that's one of the main factors. What do you find interesting? What is your passion? So writing what you know doesn't have to be about everyday life, because then I suddenly thought, well, I like writing about magic and dragons and that fantasy world. And I thought, actually, I do know about that. I've read quite a lot of books about it, you know, fantasy novels, and even how to write fantasy books. So I felt, yeah, I do also know this. So writing what you know isn't just about real life, it's also about the fictional life that you know as well. So if you've read loads of crime books, you're going to know a lot about crime fiction. So again, if you write what you know, but also what you love, that is a really good combination to do. So then that kind of leads on to, well, how do I get the ideas? How do I get the inspiration? And because, you know, some people, when I say, you know, I've written this, and they always say, well, where did you get your idea from? How do you get those ideas? And to me, I've always found it fairly easy. The short answer for me was just everywhere. But the key is being in tune with when ideas kind of hit you, because you can have an idea and if your brain isn't tuned in to kind of being aware that it's an idea, then you're going to miss it. And so once you get into the habit of making sure that you write down ideas, then your brain kind of tunes into it. Well, it does for me anyway. So one of the key things I found is that when you have an idea and you think, oh, that'd be a really good idea, write it down. If even if it's on your phone, or carry a book, pen and paper, write it down, because ideas can be very, very fleeting. In fact, that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I had this really good idea, and I think I was out and about, and I stupidly didn't write it on my phone. Now I can't remember what it was, and I really, really at the time thought it was an excellent idea. Hopefully it will come back to me. So there we are with ideas, but then you kind of think, well, sometimes you're not in the mood, and how do you get yourself into that way, into that space of letting the ideas in, because you can encourage them to come. I found that quite a lot, and for me it was always about just being in a space where your mind isn't anxious. I've always found that works. So I started to think about this, and I thought, actually, yeah, there are various ways that you can inspire ideas to pop into your head. And I've got 8 of them here. Obviously there's going to be more. Some might work for you, some might not. For me, one of the best ways of generating ideas is visiting places of beauty or that you love. And that might be 2 different things. But for example, I love churches, I love cathedrals, I love anything medieval in that respect. So I'm very fortunate. I live close to churches that are very old and ancient. I love that type of feel. And so I just go walking around there, and I don't necessarily go inside them. Sometimes I can if they're open. But just being in that space, I just generate some beautiful ideas. And again, remember to write them down. Playing your favourite music, that always works. For me, it's instrumental. It has to be instrumental. It can't be lyrics, because if I'm writing or if I'm trying to get ideas, I find the lyrics kind of cloud my ideas. They kind of fill my head up. Whereas the music, instrumental music, really just puts me in that frame of mind. Now, I love listening to Skyrim. I love the video game, and when I put that music on, it really inspires me. It really takes me back into playing the game. Lord of the Rings type music, that for me really works. Obviously, it doesn't have to be fancy if that's not your thing, but yeah, playing music, that's a real good way to get in your mind in the right frame. Also, having your own room, or a space in a room, if you haven't quite got enough rooms, that is just kind of for you and your writing, and that's your place where you write. And obviously you're creating a space that allows you to be you, and you don't feel vulnerable, you feel very safe, very cozy. And that to me also, like I really like writing just on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea. It's very basic, put some music on. But I find that really, really is conducive to writing and having ideas. Some people like going to cafes. I've got that down here as well. And again, sometimes I do that because sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of hubbub in the background, a little bit of noise, and that interaction. And you can just kind of watch people and get ideas from that. They might fascinate you the way they're talking to someone else, and that might spark, actually, if I had 2 characters and one was a bit secretive, it can just generate ideas. Libraries, they're a nice quiet space, and again, you're surrounded by books, so you could go and read books. I've also found that really helps. If I'm reading lots of books that I'm interested in, again, that can inspire you. You're not necessarily copying them, but you get inspired because you're soaking up the same type of atmosphere. Non-fiction books and also watching documentaries, I found that immensely helpful. I love watching documentaries about castles and anything medieval, basically. And also other cultures. So find documentaries that you're interested in. They can spark some great ideas, as well as non-fiction books. And then I've put here rather pretentiously, just exist. What I mean by that is just daydream. Just let yourself not worry about anything and not, I better be rushing off. Give yourself time. It could just be an hour a day. Go for that walk. But daydream, let your mind wander. And what you're doing is you're then allowing the ideas to fill up your mind. And again, the last thing here, and I've been mentioning this because it's happened to me so many times when I didn't do this. Take a notebook, write stuff down, even if it's in your phone. So the next stage is then, well, you know, I've got all these ideas and you can write them all out and then you'll be staring at them and you think, well, where do I start? And I like writing with a pen and a bit of paper. I'm not too keen straight away going straight to the computer. That's just a personal thing. I like the feel of a bit of paper and I can cross it out and I can doodle. And again, that allows me to be in a relaxed frame of mind. But then you kind of think, well, what do I do with all these ideas? Where do I begin? Should it be the characters? Should it be the story? Should it be the plot? You know, should it be trying to create the fantasy world? Well, it all depends. And I think it depends on which story as well. I've written stories where I've started with the character. I've written stories where I've started with the actual story. But for me, I started, I'll give you an example actually, The Legends of Grimace Ironblood, which is a children's book that I'm writing at the moment, what I've written, and it's now in its illustration stage. And my good friend Rich Narn, if that's, I can never pronounce his surname, in fact he told me off just the other day, he's illustrating it and he's at that process now, but I'm just about to start the next book, because once I've written one book, I start the next book, because I'm still in that frame of mind, and it means that I can carry on in the writing process. And so I read a non-fiction book. It's a reference book, which is this one here. It's quite a big book actually. It's called Encyclopedia of Things That Never Were. And this is a fantastic reference book. And I found a lovely little short story that was called The Bottled Imp. And obviously shows the bottled imp with a D on the end. You can see where we got that from. I love that story. And then I researched it and I realised that Robert Louis Stevenson had already come in and written a short story about it. But there was an aspect of it. I love the fact there was a bottle that went from one character to the next character. And that to me was the start of my story. Just that concept. It wasn't any characters, it wasn't any plot. It was just the concept of a bottle being passed to another person. And then I started asking questions about that. Who owns the bottle? Where did they get the bottle from? How did they get the bottle? And then I started to sketch that out. And then once I'd done that, I started to create the fantasy world. So I started to create magic and, you know, what's the political situation, you know, where, and then the plot slowly came. But we'll go into a lot more detail about all of that in other episodes. And then the other bit of advice I'd just say for this episode, finally, the last little chunk of advice, is read good reference books on how to write. It doesn't necessarily just how to write fantasy, but just how to write in general, because a lot of it is transferable. Now, I've got these, when I read this, The Complete Guide to Writing Fantasy, Volume 1, this really helped me. And in fact, I pretty much just finished. Well, there we go. The postman has just arrived. Hopefully, that's a contract for my next publishing gig. It probably won't be. It's probably junk mail. Oh well. But yeah, so I was reading this, The Complete Guide to Writing Fantasy. Now, I'd pretty much finished my first or second draft. And I looked at this and there were some useful hints and tips in here, and I rewrote bits and it added more depth to my book. And again, we're going to do an episode on fantasy books. Now, there's 3 volumes in this series, but that's just one series. There's loads of other fantasy, how to write fantasy books out there. I recommend that you start reading them now. And the other thing I would say is read as much fantasy as you can, because you'll get absorbed into those worlds. Now, I'm not saying copy people, don't copy people, but be inspired by them. If you want to write fantasy, you need to live in that world. Well, first of all, part 2 is all about creating your world. In fantasy, one thing that is really, really noticeable is when something is fake and when something is real. Because you're dealing in fantasy and mythical creatures and dragons and imps and ogres, obviously they don't exist in real life, do they? No, they don't. Let's say they don't. You want to start writing about those. And what I've found is that if you're writing about something fantastical and made up, it has to appear ultra real in order for your readership to actually believe it. Now, there was a quote that I really love. I watched all the the making of Lord of the Rings, and Peter Jackson said to his film crew and cast, "We're making history. We're not making a fantasy film, we're making history." And that is a really good thing to actually remember when you're writing. If any of you have read Game of Thrones or watched Game of Thrones, it's the same principle. They're making history that happens to have fantasy elements in it. Now, part one was all about starting with your ideas and why you want to write fantasy, the urge to write fantasy. And we looked about inspiration and where you can maybe create inspiration to generate ideas. And once you've generated all those ideas, well, what do you do with them? Well, the thing is, for me, before I could start writing my story and, you know, letting my characters run wild, I decided I'd have to do a little bit of planning on world building, because I wanted to know various things within the world that my characters are going to exist. I wanted to know what that world is. And what I decided to do was I started writing about what the political situation was, what the religious situation was, you know, what sort of clothes do they wear, what money do they use, all of that. And there came a point where I got a bit bogged down with that, and it was, well, actually, I think I've got enough now to just start writing the story. And that is something that will be special to you. Only you will know when you're ready to start writing your story. So that said, you might just think, well, I've got the characters, I've got a bit of a vague story going on. Yeah, go ahead and start writing. Some people do it that way around. They create the world as they're writing. Other people, like myself, like to do a little bit of planning. But there does come a cut-off point where you could just spend years and years and years creating your fantasy world without actually writing your story. So the feeling of starting writing a story can be overwhelming. So what I decided to do, I decided to break down various ways to just start writing so it doesn't feel overwhelming. Do little small steps. And the first thing I decided to do, it just kind of happened naturally and it seemed to work, was start concentrating on your actual characters. Now, the very least, you should know your main character or characters very, very well. And that means that you have to create a profile for each of your main characters. Now, you know, if you're not big into doing that, that's fine. Some people do that on the hoof. But I found it very useful because if I know my characters before I start writing, I'll know how they're going to react to things. I will know their motivations. I know what drives them. And for me, that's really key when you're writing fantasy or any type of writing, actually. So it's a good idea to start fleshing out your characters before you start writing. One way of doing that is just to ask as many questions about your characters as possible. What you want to do is write a profile for each of your characters. You've got to ask yourself not just about their physical appearance, because obviously, yes, you want to know what they look like, you want to know how fast they can run, you want to know all their physical attributes, what colour eye they have, all of that. But also you want to know what their mind is about, what their heart's about. You want to know their spiritual side, and you want to know their intellectual side as well. So that's key. So what I decided to do was then, the other thing is that how do they see themselves? You know, we've all got an opinion of what we think we're like, which can be very, very different, trust me, to what other people actually think of you and what reality is. So I might think I'm hilarious and very witty, and then actually my friends think, no, he's not. He tries to be funny, but he can't. That's a bit too close for comfort there. But anyway, that's kind of, what I'm trying to get at. So that's really interesting because you could have two characters talking about another character and they're really saying how wonderful he is and how amazing he is. And then the other character comes in and is horrible to somebody and the reader thinks, well, hang on, that's a distorted image. So then it just adds that extra depth to all your characters. And it gives you a chance to play against type as well, because if people think that one character is particularly nasty, then when they do an act of kindness, that's a really nice twist, a really nice character arc that you can put in there. So you got to start asking questions such as what their religious views are, what's their political views, what's their ethical views. Are they moral? Are they lawful? Are they unlawful? Would they, they don't mind stealing? Would they murder someone? How far do their morals stretch? You've also got to ask yourself what their underlying motivation is. Is it money? Are they greedy? Is it kindness? Do they just think that, you know, our place on earth is to just be kind to everybody? Is it love? So what's their underlying motivation? There might be 2 or 3 of those. And if you work all that out, then you'll know how they're going to react to a situation. One thing, a good question to ask about your characters is, how do they get on with animals? Do they love animals? Are they kind to animals? Because that, again, can be a good reflection on how they're going to behave towards other races. And especially in fantasy, you've got orcs and elves and all those other races. How do they feel about all the other races? So that, again, gives more depth and more believability to your characters. You've got to ask yourself what their dreams are, what their ambitions are. You know, we all have desires in life. And are they happy with their life? Do they want more? Are they unhappy? And if so, why are they unhappy? As I say, asking all these questions will add depth to your characters. Then you've got to look at their backgrounds. Were they brought up poor? Were they brought up rich? Were they jealous of their brothers and sisters? You know, there's lots of questions in their background that shape who they are at that present time when you first start writing about the characters. And remember, characters need to go on a development, an arc, a journey. So again, start thinking about, if you know what their motivations are, then they'll start planning to get whatever they want, and that will spark the actual character arc and the journey itself. One thing I thought was very fascinating is doing a profile for yourself. So ask all those questions about yourself. What's your loves, your desires, all of that, because that's a good way, a good practice way of just creating a character. And try and be as honest as possible, because you'll find that you can fill in loads of detail, because you might think, well, this is a bit overwhelming. But I find the more you start writing, the more it just flows. That is a really good exercise. I did that, and sometimes it can be quite shocking. So once you've got your characters, and by then, you know, that'll be quite fully rounded characters. You've got enough information about them. But now we're going to ask about what type of world they actually exist in. And obviously, the world that they exist in can influence and will affect their behaviour. And again, that creates part of their story arc. So, again, it can be overwhelming when you think about the world. It's a big, scary place. I have thought of categories to just tackle about asking yourself about what is in your world. And I came up with a list of 22. It was not just me thinking, you know, various how to write books and various websites over the years that I've read. There's 22 categories, which again is a bit overwhelming. Now, you won't need to flesh out all 22 categories, because that is what I tried to do and it just became too much. So you kind of think, well, I'll pick some key ones. What do I think is necessary? Because you might have an idea of what your story is going to be about. So if it's sort of political, it's very political orientated, then you're going to have to work out, is there a government, is there a monarchy? So there's going to be some that are more priority driven than others. So some examples that I'll just share with you now. Now I will put I'll put this whole list in the description of the YouTube channel for you to look at, and also I'll be mentioning some reference books at the end, and I'll list all of those as well. So my fantasy world is called Edra, and I really like the Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, medieval fantasy England type feel. So that's exactly what I did. I put a little bit of low-level steampunk into it as well. So you've got to think about, for me, the politics and the power. Was it a monarchy? Is it government? What are the creatures and the monsters? What are they all about? And if there's an earthquake, you might have noticed there's an earthquake there with the camera. You've got to know about technology, and can you use, you know, what sort of technology, what level of technology have they got? As I say, I really like steampunk, so I put a little bit of steampunk technology into my one. What are their jobs and their professions? You know, is it the normal? It's good to do research on medieval jobs and professions. Their clothes, costumes, I had to think about that. What are their traditions and festivals? Because you can tell a lot about a race about their traditions and festivals. And obviously their religion, that's again another thing I thought about. And the money system, what sort of money do they have? Now, because mine's steampunk, I thought cogs. So I called mine coglets. And they're sort of little gems in the middle of the metal, and they're shaped like cogs. Just something a little bit different, a little bit of flavour. But there does come a limit, as I say, you'll start getting overwhelmed. So you'll know when you start fleshing out your world, where, you know, when you can start actually writing. And as you continue to write, you might crop up, there might be something like, oh yeah, I don't need to worry about money because nobody's buying anything. But then you might write a scene where somebody actually does buy something, and then you have to start thinking of the money. Obviously, that's fine. So what else here? What have I got here? You'll also need to know pretty much every single detail of your world as you write. But for me, just starting writing does generate more ideas and more questions. You can, because it's fantasy, it does have to have rules and facts, like laws of nature, for example, because otherwise it becomes unbelievable. Magic is obviously going to be a key factor in a fantasy book. You have to work out everything about magic. No, not everything, but a lot about magic before you write. That would be my advice. Does everybody have magic? Is it easily attained? Is there different types of magic? Who controls the magic? Does anyone control the magic? Or is it very low level? Or has it not been discovered yet and somebody discovers magic and then tries to keep it secret? Anything to do with magic, I would definitely try and work out. Ask loads of questions. What would it be like in a world where everybody had magic? It'd be crazy, wouldn't it? So you'd have to then put laws in place to stop people casting spells all the time, because it'd be dangerous. But remember, you're in control of this, so you can put in as much or as little of magic in as you like. There are some really good reference books. I've got a selection here that I've just collected over the years. These, for example, the Element Encyclopedia selection here, they're just amazing. They're thick, chunky books full of loads of information. So you can, like this one, for example, the Encyclopedia of Secret Societies. If you're trying to think up of a magician's guild, well, if you've been reading about an actual one that existed in history, you could kind of base it on that and modify it a bit. It's an inspiration. And again, this one of witchcraft is fantastic. I've got one here of magical creatures. So those are absolutely amazing. Totally recommend these. Now again, I'll put all these in the descriptions. One brilliant thing to create your world, and is this series here. I have mentioned these before, and that's the Complete Guide to Writing Fantasy. And there's 3 volumes. Totally recommend them. I actually didn't cotton on to them. I didn't discover them until I'd pretty much finished writing my first draft. And once I read those, I went back and added a few more things in, and it really revolutionised my world. I was really happy with reading those. We've got here, there's this one, the Writer's Complete Fantasy Reference Book. What else? Oh, the other thing I would recommend is definitely get yourself some baby name books, because you will need to come up with names for your characters. It's always nice to have slightly different names. For me anyway, names that you can pronounce, that make sense. And having good baby name books is brilliant. Obviously, there's lots of websites now that do naming baby websites as well, so you can tap into those. But they're really fun to play with, joining 2 names together to create a new name. And what I would also recommend, mine's in verse. And when I discovered that you can actually get the Oxford Rhyming Dictionary, that was a godsend. It was brilliant. And I discovered new words I didn't know, but it was good because I could rhyme them. So I then looked them up in a good, decent dictionary. Now I've got here the Oxford Concise Dictionary. Recommend a really good dictionary, don't get a cheap one. And also you need a thesaurus, because it's, you'll be writing and you want to keep your readers interested. You want them to be interested in what you're writing, and a good way is obviously to find different ways of expressing what you want to say. That is basically the foundation of modern fantasy, and that's what everybody, if you say fantasy, this is what really, if people who aren't into fantasy and don't really know anything else, this is the fantasy type that they will be thinking of. It's Lord of the Rings, it's The Hobbit, it's medieval with magic, it's that kind of fantasy. But it does have other characteristics that are different from the other types of fantasy. These are big in scope. They're normally over 100,000 words, so they're big tomes. And they deal with the biggest possible issues, such as saving the world, rescuing an entire universe from the forces of darkness. And they generally have a big final, they're all leading up to a big final battle between good and evil. So it's that apocalyptic sort of event that's going to happen. So they're big issue stories. And that is really what epic fantasy is. And then we have high fantasy, which is very closely related to epic fantasy. Now, these stories are a little bit more personal than epic fantasies, and they're more limited to the needs and desires of an individual hero. So the protagonist is the focus of a single, and also a single villain as well. So you've got a protagonist who's up against a single villain, and it's their personal goals and motivation that drive the story. Yes, there might be a bigger story happening in the background, but that's generally not the focus. And then we have sword and sorcery. Now this category is similar in scope, but there's less focus on world building, and there's more focus on the actual action, on the spirit of action, and really moving the plot quite quickly. Now these tend to be axe swinging kind of heroes and barbarians. So think Conan the Barbarian basically. And they're determined to slay their enemies. They've got some sort of revenge mission, or they're just bloodthirsty for whatever reason. There's normally some sexy femme fatales that they need to rescue. It's not necessarily my kind of fantasy, but it is a very popular type of fantasy. It's basically, there's a bad guy, and that bad guy needs to be killed by the good guy. And there's not too much nuance in there. Dark fantasy, on the other hand, that shouldn't be confused with horror, because dark fantasy isn't necessarily about food. It's not necessarily, I can't even say that word. Yay, let's add that to the group of words I can't say. That's not basically, does that work? It's not meant to be scary. So dark fantasy isn't horror because it doesn't have to be scary. It just deals with those dark, horror-esque themes. So also in dark fantasy, the heroes may not win, and it may not be the traditional hero either. You can have lots of anti-heroes in dark fantasy, and they're people who have, their morality and ethics are questionable. They're not necessarily always going to be doing the good thing. But again, they might be. So they're quite fascinating characters to write, anti-heroes. Now, the world building in this is equally dark, and there are stories where evil has trumped over good. So you've already established that good is losing. And it's basically the survival of the fittest, and virtue isn't necessarily its own reward. So there's a lot to think about with dark fantasy. Contemporary fantasy, otherwise known as urban fantasy, now that mixes with the horror genre as well, but the focus is more on monsters, especially vampires and werewolves. They seem to be very popular at the moment in contemporary fantasy. Think Twilight. It's unlike horror though, because again, it doesn't have to scare you. It might, but it doesn't have to. And I think with horror, out and out horror, that's one of its prime objective, isn't it? Is to scare you. These ones aren't necessarily set in a fantasy location. They're actually set, I guess this is why people call it contemporary and urban, because they're set in the real world. And they're normally set in the present day as well. Now, there might be elements, there might be portals into other worlds, or there might be the supernatural coming into our world. That is all in contemporary fantasy. And then we have historical fantasy, and that's solid grounding in the real world, but a real world of years ago, or even, centuries past. And it doesn't have to be medieval. You can have fantasy in other eras as well. So authors do have the entire world history to explore. So you can, why not set fantasy in Victorian England, or, the Civil War in America, or even, Japan. So there are lots of scope for you to actually have a good setting, but it has to be kind of in history and a real life history. There are endless possibilities with this one. And then lastly, we have erotic fantasy. Now, I don't really read erotic fantasy, so I don't know too much about it. But it's the main objective. It's also known as a fantasy romance as well. But the main aspect is sex or romance. It doesn't just focus on sex, but that's the prime storyline, if you like. Now, I think it's a good idea to put sex and romance in other categories. So if you're writing a dark fantasy, have a romance running through that. but tune that into dark fantasy. So it could be a doomed love story as opposed to it's all going to work out and it's going to be happy, because that really wouldn't fit dark fantasy. But erotic fantasy does mainly focus on the sex and romance. And then we have story structure. So why is it important to have story structure? Well, I think it's quite a good map for your characters, and it does keep your writing focused, because it kind of stops you from going off too many tangents, and then your whole novel can become unwieldy. This does keep you focused. So if you know that, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to plot it out in fine detail, although some authors do, but as long as you know sort of maybe main events, that can keep you on track. It also, as I say, it does break your story into manageable chunks so you don't get overwhelmed. And it does keep track of your story arcs and your character arcs as well. Now, there are lots of different structures, but there is a classic 3-act structure, and that is simply the beginning, middle, and end. And that is used quite a lot. That's the main one that most people use. But as I say, there are others. We haven't got time to go into all of that, but we'll just quickly go through the beginning, middle, and end. So Act 1, the beginning, that's where you establish your protagonist, and basically they do recommend you do that on page 1 or as close as it, because then people know that he or she is your main character right from the get-go. And it also establishes a viewpoint. Should you do it from the first point of view, or should you do it from the third point of view? It's very tricky to do it from the second point of view. Ian Banks has done that, and he did that very well in Complicity, but it's not necessarily for the novice, the second point of view. It also establishes the conflict that the protagonist will have between the antagonist or any other characters. And there might be a few subplots that you start to write about in Act 1. Act 2, you continue all of that, so it carries on from Act 1, but then you complicate them as much as you can, put loads of twists in, really surprising events happen to keep your audience interested. Think Game of Thrones, if you've read or seen Game of Thrones. And your character situation should be getting worse, not better, basically, in Act 2. Act 2 is traditionally the longer of all the acts, because that's where things really develop. And then you move on to Act 3, and that's where you start wrapping all of your subplots and all of your main plots up, basically. And as I say, towards the end, you're building up to a resolution. Now, it doesn't have to be a happy resolution, but everything needs to tie up, because that gives the audience, the reader, satisfaction. And a good story structure book that I recommend is by William Bernard, and it's called Story Structure, The Key to Successful Fiction, and that's in the Red Sneaker Writers book series. I recommend that one. There are plenty out there as well. Now, so it's a good idea to just write an outline of the scenes as well, because then again, you'll know what leads on. But some authors don't do that. Some authors, once they've got their characters in their head, they just start writing and they see where it takes them. And that's perfectly valid. There isn't really a right or wrong way. But I guess if you're starting out, it's always good to kind of follow certain known rules that work for writers. And then as you get more experience, then you can start breaking them if you want to. And lastly, theme. What is theme? Or, has your book got any theme or themes in it? And it's very important, because that's the way that your readers will connect to your book on a human, emotional level. And that's what you want. That's what gives your book depth. It's the pulse of the story, basically, and it's got to appeal to the reader and you, because you're going to be writing this book for quite a while. You're going to invest a lot of time and emotion into it, hopefully. So you need to find your theme or themes appealing. It needs to speak to you. And when it does, you will be writing authentically. So you might have had experience about your theme and you want to put it into your book. That is so powerful. Examples of theme are ambition, alienation, death, freedom. What else have I got here? Loss of life, innocence, survival, power. And all the way through your novel, that theme should be there, like kind of like a drum beat in the background, constantly reminding, because that will keep the audience connected. And as I say, you need to be connected, so you need to find it interesting. Now, in my book, The Legends of Grimace Ironblood, I chose a couple of themes. I chose compassion and kindness, because I'm very intrigued by why people are kind and compassionate, and reaction to if someone is kind and compassionate to you, how do you deal with that? It's not always you think, well, what are they after? Can you be kind and compassionate without being after anything, without trying to manipulate people? Jealousy and hatred, always fascinated by that, why somebody will be jealous of somebody else. I'm always fascinated by that. And also the loss of a loved one and loneliness. And I think those themes are quite a lot of themes that you pick. They're very universal, so your audience can connect to that. Certainly a loss of a loved one, I guess most people go through that at some point in their life, and they will connect to that. And hopefully they will, find maybe not comfort, but they will connect to it on an emotional level, and that will add depth to your novel. As I say, you've probably just finished your first draft, so what do you do with it now? And as I say, this one's all about rewriting, because this kind of is where your novel will take shape. The great thing about doing a first draft is no one else need read it. So you can be vulnerable, you can just pour your heart out, you can make your mistakes, you don't have to be perfect. That comes later, that comes after all the rewrites. And that's the beauty of it. When I first started writing, I actually used to really want to get the first draft perfect, and it used to paralyze me. And then I realized, do you know what? I don't have to do that. No one's going to be reading this. So it's all in the rewriting. But let's take a closer look at rewriting and what exactly is it. Now, for me, as I say, rewriting is where you really do shape your novel and your work. And what I tend to do is, because if you've been writing something on and off, or maybe full time for, a good 6 months maybe, then you're going to be fully immersed in it. And that's a good thing, because obviously if you're writing something, you want to be really in the zone and really know about what you're writing. But then when it comes to rewriting, that can be kind of detrimental to you, because you may feel drained. You might, you'll have mixed emotions, because you'll be, yay, I've finished the first draft, but then you feel like, wow, what a journey, because you'll have lived your characters' journeys for you, and obviously, hopefully, it's an emotional journey. So you're going to be drained. So my first tip would be, have a break. Be kind to yourself. Congratulations, you've finished your first draft, and that is a big achievement. Now, I would say have at least 2 days off, 3 days, maybe a week. I remember sort of taking 2 days or 2 weeks, or maybe 3 weeks after I finished the first draft of my children's fantasy book, The Legends of Grimace Ironblood, because I was really involved with it, and I just needed to get away, and I felt I just wasn't going to rush into rewriting it. So I just kind of felt, 2-3 weeks, that was enough time to get a distance, because you want to be critical of your first draft. And and that's fine. You don't want anyone else to be critical of it, because it's vulnerable. You've just poured your heart out, and you've made mistakes in there. There'll be things that you read and you'll go, hang on, did I write that? That's terrible. But that doesn't matter. You need to make this the best book that you can. So what I would recommend is, when you come back, have fresh eyes. Think of it as though you've never read it before. Think of it as a reader would when they read it for the first time. And so when I do a rewrite, what I do is I will first of all look for an overall general feeling. Did I capture the essence and the flavour, the feel of what I was actually trying to do with my work? Did it flow properly? Did I capture exactly what I wanted? And if not, then this is the time to change it. Be critical, because if you get the feeling right, the flavour of it, the tone of it right, then everything else kind of seems to fall into place after that. So once you've then gone through it all, ask all those questions. Does anything jar? Is anything out of place? Be tough on it. Make a list. I love lists. And then just go through it again and take your time. And you rewrite, take your time on this as well. It's just as important as when you do your first draft. Then, once you've done all the rewriting of just the feel of it, have another little break, maybe a day. And then what you want to do is you want to go back to it again, try to be as critical as you can. Doesn't matter. You're being critical of your own work. So, it's not like someone else is being critical of it. And then what you want to do is I then start on the characters. Did the characters fulfill what you saw in them? You know, when you were writing them, did they flow as you wanted them to flow? Did they have their own unique voices? Are they different and unique from each other? Are the names, are they pronounceable? Because yeah, as you probably, if you've been watching any of our episodes, I'm not brilliant at pronouncing names. So when I was writing my book, The Legends of Grimace Ironblood, I decided that I would try to have names that weren't too outlandish. Because obviously you're writing fantasy, so you want your names to be slightly exotic. Things like that, anything that jars with the characters. Did they, and the other thing you have to do is keep track of your characters, and this is very important. I would write a timeline. So go through and just concentrate on one character and write exactly where they are and write it out on a timeline, and then pick another character and write it on the same timeline but below, so you know where all the characters are. You can pinpoint them. So if, you know, character A is in the tavern for 3 chapters, probably getting drunk, and where's character B? Do they come into the tavern at any point? You know, so if they're in the tavern, are they, you know, in a mountain, you know, fighting a dragon? Keep an eye on that, because what you don't want is any inconsistencies of where they are in time and place in your story. And the other thing is, what are they wearing? Now that's sometimes overlooked, because obviously if a character puts down their hat and then they're in the next scene or the next chapter and they've kind of got their hat on again, it might not feel important, but sometimes that can break the illusion that you're trying to create, because obviously the fourth wall in acting, where you kind of, you know, you don't want to break that illusion that you've set up for your reader. And so little details like that can really kind of jar with the reader, because they'll say, well, hang on though, he didn't pick his hat up, and or that sword was destroyed and then next time he's using his sword again. That doesn't make sense. So you've got to look for any inconsistencies and iron them out with the character. And then have another day's break, because you don't want to overload, you don't want to get too, you know, bogged down with too much detail all at once. So I'd say have another day's break. Then you want to look at, I kind of then look at my actual fantasy world and the landscape of it and how I built the fantasy world. So obviously, being fantasy, magic is key. Magic is very, very important. So you want to look at all the inconsistencies or consistencies in the way that you've introduced magic. Is it clear? Is magic maybe too dominant? Is it too easy for your heroes because they, you know, they can just use magic whenever? You've got to plan how your magic is going to be used and do it in a consistent and precise way. Sometimes, you know, this can be one of the trickiest things. You know, I've got a character that can use magic. It's Grimace Ironblood, who's one of the main characters, and I'm working out exactly how he can use magic and why he can use magic. And then when he uses magic for the first time, people see him do that, but they're amazed, and I say that it's quite a rare occurrence. So things like that. So now, okay, the audience know that magic is quite rare. And if another character uses it, they've got to ask themselves, well, how can they use magic as well? So you've got to be clear about how your magic is being used. Likewise, you've got to look at all the other world-building elements, such as if you've created a political system or a kingship. If there's kings and queens, are they consistent in the way that they rule? You've got to look at religious aspects. If you create a religion, have you thought out all of those consistencies? You know, you can then start going into further detail. You've got to ask yourself, what would the reader be asking of your world? So those are very important indeed. So if there are any laws that are, you know, broken, you know, you've got to fix them. And obviously, this is what the first draft is all about. Then, after that, once I've done that, again, I'd have another little break, because again, you don't want to overload yourself. You've just got to generally go through to see if everything else makes sense. As a reader, you've got to be try to be as objective as possible, because there's no point in trying to flatter yourself. And if you think that something is really brilliantly written, it might not be. And vice versa, if you think, oh, that doesn't really work, it might be. So you have to think, does it really make sense? Does everything make sense? You've got to iron out any inconsistencies and be critical. That was exactly what I had to be. You know, when I first wrote it, I was dead set on the way that the chapters unfolded and the way, you know, the order of the characters, the main characters were introduced. And then on my third or fourth draft, I went, oh no, actually, hang on, this character needs to start the book. I just felt it was more of an impact beginning. But it took me 3 or 4 drafts to actually make that decision. And that was the final tip I'd pretty much say is always do not be afraid of changing anything. At this stage, if you change anything, it's fine because no one else is reading it. Don't be afraid of that change. After all, you know, when you see an artist paint, they will sketch first of all, and they'll be rubbing things out, changing things. You know, they'll do sketches. This is what your first draft is all about, and editing and proofreading and rewriting is all about. So I would say rewrite this as many times as you possibly can, because you want this to be the best that you can make it, and rewriting is your chance to do that. And also, what I would say is proofread it. Do that separately. Don't try to do all of it at the same time, because your brain will overload and it will hurt. Believe me, I've tried doing that. So then, once you feel like you've got the story, and it might take you 10 drafts, 11 drafts, however many, do a proofread for spellings and punctuation and grammar. Now, there are various online resources. There's also books that you can buy. It's key, because obviously if somebody is reading this, they expect all the punctuations and the spelling and the grammar to be correct. Be consistent with those, because there are various ways that you can do it. Be consistent. Read other novels that you like and see how they do their grammar. It's always a good tip to look at that. And then you can just be consistent with that, because if there's nothing worse if you read something and there's poorly spelt words or the grammars, that again can break the illusion. So that's the question that you need to ask yourself. Do I go down the traditional publishing route, or do you self-publish? And if you self-publish, do you need an agent? So with the traditional publishing, that kind of means that yes, publisher will take your manuscript on and they will do pretty much everything for you. They will market your book, they will design a cover. If there's illustrations that need doing, they will match an illustrator to it and do the illustrations. And they will obviously take their cut of the sales, because if you think about it, they're doing quite a lot for you. There's a sales team, there's marketing, and you'll get a percentage. So it might be anywhere of 6% or 8%, depending on what it is. It could be a bit higher, it might be a bit lower. And obviously that's where agents come in, because agents know about contracts. Now, with the traditional publishing, if you're to send your work directly to a publisher, you've got to be careful, because some of them don't accept unsolicited manuscripts. You may see that, in fact, you probably will see that on websites. And what that means is that, yes, they don't take from authors who are not represented by agents, because they are inundated by manuscripts, and it just, I guess, becomes nigh on impossible to start reading through. So they need a filter, and so they've got an in-house filter, because they'll have various readers that will be reading what they call a slush pile, where manuscripts that do come in, and from agents, and then they'll have, and there's like there's X amount of readers before it actually gets to anyone that can make a real decision on whether or not they're going to actually invest money and time and effort into publishing that work. And so an agent kind of bypasses some of that slush pile, and maybe gets it into the hands of somebody who can just make a decision there and then. So you've got to ask yourself, okay, if I can't send to a publisher, then are there publishers that do accept unsolicited manuscripts? And the answer is yes. But what you might find is that you don't know which ones do and which ones don't. So there's a great reference book called Writers and Artists Yearbook. I think there is one that's just writers, as just for writers, but this one's also got artists, so if you're an artist, this is a good resource as well. And obviously my one's 2005, so you obviously want to get the most up-to-date version, not this one. And in here you'll find lots of information, great advice about how to write a cover letter, how to approach them, and also there's a list, as I say, of agents and publishers, and that's very important that you find the correct publisher for your work, because obviously if I've written it's kind of aimed at children, so it could be if it's a children's book, then I'm not going to send my work to a publisher that just doesn't take on children's books, because that'd be pointless. Equally, if you've got a cooking book, there's no point in sending it to a publisher that only publishes fantasy. So those are the things and they sound very obvious mistakes to make, but I guess you'll be surprised. And again, with cover letters, you need to make sure that you keep it short, keep it precise, and tell them a little bit about your book. Don't go on too much, and also a little bit about yourself and why you've kind of connected to the work that you've written. And also, publishers like to know whether you've got other ideas as well, so you can also mention the other book that you've started to work on. Even if it's just an idea and you haven't started working on it, they want to know you're just not a one-hit wonder, and that they want a writing career from you. They want several books in the future. The other thing to work out is you need to find out about their submissions guide, because each publisher might do it differently. If they want it via email and they only want it in electronic format, i.e. a Word document, then do that. Don't then print out a hard copy and send it to them, because it won't get read, and they are that strict because they get so many manuscripts sent to them. They can afford to be. Equally, if they want it uploaded to their website, do that. And they may specify a certain format that they want it. It could be that you need to double space it. It could be that you need to leave a wider margin on one of the sides, because then the people that are going to be reading your manuscript can make notes. So things like that. And those are really small but important details if you're going to approach a publisher directly. Equally, if you're going to approach an agent, again, look up the agent, see if they're the sort of thing that they might be agents that only specialise in non-fiction, so you've got to check those out. And again, do a short, courteous cover letter, and again, maybe email them. Make sure you know the name of the person that you need to contact, which should be in that book. And then, yeah, hopefully, you'll get representation. Now, why would you want an agent? Well, I think there are advantages, obviously, because they know contracts. They also have contact within the publishing industry, so obviously they can get your manuscript into people that matter. Whereas if you just send yours off, why should they read your book? If I'm going to be really harsh. And so there are advantages. I guess the disadvantage that they will be getting a cut of any royalties and any money, but then hey, they've done you a service, so it's not really that bad. But those are the things you have to think about. And then of course you've got self-publishing. Now I went down the self-publishing route mainly because I had written my book on and off for about 4 years, and I just wanted to see it published and printed and in book form. I thought, well, if I send it to a publisher, I may get rejected. That might take X amount of years before I actually do get picked up, or if I send it to an agent, they might reject it. And it's just that long-winded process, because it might take you 3 or 4 years from when you start sending your work out to actually getting published. I know that sounds really brutal, but that is the truth of it, because again, they might need a year to gear up your book, get it all ready to actually get it printed. Now obviously if you go down the self-publishing route, then you've still got to get somebody to typeset it, to design the cover, and again if it's illustrated you need an illustrator. So those are other things you may need to consider. And again, the disadvantage is the cost. You need to have a certain amount of money to be able to print your book. And it's not only the printing, like I say. I was very lucky. I'm a graphic designer. I used to be a graphic designer, so I know how to typeset a book. So I didn't have to pay someone to do that. Equally, I was very lucky. My friend Rich Nan, he did a great job with the illustrations. He designed the cover. I designed the cover, but he drew the actual image on the cover. So again, I had resources to pull on. And a friend of mine, Kate Miller, she's an editor and a writer herself, and she very kindly edited it for me as well. So I was very, very lucky. Plus, there's something called an ISBN, and all books have them. Let's have a look. This barcode here, you won't see it in detail, but there is a number above the barcode. That is a unique number for every single title that gets published, and it's international, and you'll need to purchase one of those, and normally they sell them only in blocks of 10, and I believe mine was about £150. And of course, that will cover me for now for 10 books. So that's basically 10 years. I'm hoping to publish one each year. So again, you have to factor in those costs. So you might think, wow, if I get it printed and it costs me, I don't know, £6, and I'm selling it for £10, that's £4 profit. Well, it might not be, because obviously if you're going to be sending them that yourself, you need well, they pay for postage, but it might be that you need to obviously buy the packaging. You'll then maybe, you've got to figure in graphic design costs, you've got to figure in, and then don't get me started on the marketing, because of course you then need to market your book, because your book might be the best book that's been ever written, but of course, if it won't sell if nobody's heard of it. So again, that's a whole different, well, in fact we'll do another episode on marketing because it's such a big subject. So those are the things you really do have to consider now, whether you go for publishing, the traditional route, and try and get yourself an agent, or you can self-publish. Now, it sounds like I'm being all negative about this, but this is probably, I mean, yeah, writing a book, that is hard, and that's going to put your soul and your effort, and it's your baby, and you want it to do well. But of course, you want people to read it. That's kind of half the process, isn't it? You want people to enjoy it. And so, yes, you do need to try and get it published. So self-publishing, don't be put off if you're determined to get your work out there. Of course, you could just go to Kindle and get it digitalized, and you do a digital version, and maybe that's a good way to start off. Just go to Kindle, and they got very clear, go to Amazon, they got very clear instructions about how to create a digital formatted book. But again, you are going to run into the marketing problems. How do you get people to know about your work? And we haven't gone into massive detail in each episode, but I just wanted to give you my personal journey and a bit of an overview of how I found things. Now, marketing, this bit is actually the weakest of my areas, so I'm really, determined to find out exactly how to do this properly. And I thought, well, how does it work? If you're creative, you're not necessarily business-minded, and you're not necessarily, wanting to go out and try and sell your book and all that horrible business to do with the business. But unfortunately, kind of if you're self-published, so this is really talking about if you're self-published like myself, this is kind of what you have to do, because ultimately no one's going to do it for you, unless, of course, you do hire a marketing company. Now, I don't necessarily going to go down that route because I don't know how much they charge. I've not looked into that. They might charge a fortune, they might charge a little amount. So maybe that's the first step. Do a bit of research, find out how a marketing company can help you. They might be able to help you loads, but they might not be. But I decided I could draw up a plan of action. So I've got it here, and this is what I'm going to be implementing. So hopefully, fingers crossed, it will work. And I just brainstormed some ideas that seemed pretty practical and pretty sensible, and something that will be achievable on a really low budget. Now, you will have to spend a bit of money, but not masses and masses of money, and hopefully it can be effective. And the first thing that happened, it happened by accident really. I was off doing a workshop about how to write for graphic novels and comics. And that was up in London, and what I didn't realise, it was actually organised by a writers' union, and it's the Writers Guild of Great Britain, and they, as I say, they're a union. And when I got chatting afterwards to the union rep, it was like really interesting because they offer help and support. They also offer workshops like that and seminars and talks. So there's a lot going on in a union. Now, when I looked on their website, they've got details about what to charge if you're hired as a writer. And also they can cover any legal aspect, and they have a rep that covers certain areas throughout the country. So I thought, yes, it's that support, it's that information and that help that you can get if you join a union. And also it's good for networking. Now, I'm not somebody who's been brilliant at networking, because there's that whole human aspect of, oh, I'm really only talking to you because I want something back from you. I'm trying to glean information or your contacts or something like that. And I felt it was a little bit, I don't know, it's just something I didn't quite like about that. But I realised actually, as long as you're giving back as well, as long as you can contribute, then it's kind of like a two-way process. And the other thing that I hadn't realised is obviously you're going to be networking with like-minded people. So for example, when I was chatting to people afterwards, networking is just chatting, and we were just talking about things we like, talking about how we could maybe write for comics. There was a few artists there as well, and what their experiences were. So it was kind of, it didn't feel like kind of what I thought was networking, which seemed a bit horrible. So again, that's another good reason why maybe you could join a union. And the Writers Guild of Great Britain, there's actually 3 different tiers, and you pay a different amount. They, if you've not written professionally, they don't just let you be a full member, but there are different tiers. So I've joined one of the lesser ones because I've self-published, so they allow you to join. And I'm, going to hopefully get a bit more heavily involved with that. The other aspect is obviously social media. Nowadays, it's very easy to set up things in social media, and the first port of call really, I guess, is Twitter and Facebook. It's very easy to set up a Facebook page. Most people have probably got their own personal Facebook pages. So I would recommend that you set up an author one, because you may have a pen name, a different name that you're going to use for your author one. Like my one is KR Boiter. That's the name I'm writing under. I'm just putting my initials and then my surname. And that also happens to be my Facebook. So I made a slight mistake, but I set that up years ago. That's also my personal one as well. But then I don't tend to put too much of my own personal life into it. But I put a few things up that's personal, but then something that I think very carefully about this, about your image, because you don't want people to be put off you just because you've got some bizarre views about things. Keep that to yourself. So there's your own author Facebook page, and then also you can set up your book Facebook page as well, so that's dedicated purely to your book. And it's a good place for people can actually communicate with each other as well, so hopefully you build up a fan base. Plus, of course, you've got Twitter. Now, Twitter, to me, is a little bit murky. I've started using Twitter, but I'm not a natural Twitty, if that's what you call it. But it is part of the marketing process. It helps you. All of this helps you get a web presence and get your name out there, raise your profile. And I'm sure there are videos out there that you can how to set up a Twitter page, how to use it effectively. I'm sure there are lots of videos online about that, so you can check them out. And also you may want to set up your own website as well if you haven't done so already. And again, I would use the same author name that you're going to be using because you need it to all link in and look professional, and so you don't confuse people. Now, I guess there's a couple of ways you can go around that. Hopefully you'll know someone that can help you set up a website, or you can do it yourself. If you're not that technically minded, there are good websites now that can help you. I actually use Weebly because it's really simple. You can just drag and drop into position on your page. You basically choose a template that you feel would suit what you want to do, and then you drag the various components into place, and then you fill it with your content. You can upload images, you can type in text, that kind of thing. And that's weebly.com, and I find that very, very helpful. Or obviously you can pay someone to do your website, but be careful because you might end up spending a fortune, and really you could have done it yourself, or again ask somebody. But there you go. I do recommend definitely getting a website because you need your web presence to be pretty visible and pretty high, and then obviously you can direct people from one website to the Twitter to the Facebook, that kind of thing as well. And obviously you want to advertise where people can buy your book. So what else would I recommend? I've got on my list here, send your book out to reviewers. Now that's something I'll be doing over the next couple of weeks. A little bit nervous about that. Now obviously at the Bottled Imp we review things as well, so it's only fair that I send my book out to get reviewed as well, and I would expect an honest review just like I give honest reviews. But the main thing about this is I would look at the people that you're sending your book to. There's no point in sending it out to people that won't appreciate your book as such. So if yours is a kid's book, for example, there's no point in sending it to a reviewer who doesn't review kids' books. Equally, some people might not review self-published books. Now, I guess you could maybe get away with that. You create your own, impress. You can create your own publisher name and maybe pretend. But if you're not a bit shady like that and you don't really want to do that, then obviously make sure that they do accept self-published books as well. And I would recommend that you would go for traditional as well as the more modern ways of reviewing books and things, such as the websites. So you can go for traditional, which is the newspapers. Now I'm gonna just look into sending it out to national newspapers. Why not? I got nothing to lose. They might not accept it at all. They might do, but I'm gonna have a go. And equally, your local newspaper may do some sort of review, or maybe a lifestyle magazine that that they'd be quite interested in because you're a local author. And the other thing about the websites is that there are, as I say, there's YouTube channels, and there are also vloggers and also bloggers as well that will just be writing about rather than doing it to camera. So check those out, do your research, and make sure that you pick relevant people that would review your book. Also, I would recommend that you make sure it's available on Amazon. Now, if you just bear with me with 1 second, I'm going to disappear. I'll be back in a second. And what I'm going to say is that with Amazon, you do need on your book to have this ISBN. Now, this is an international book standard number, which is unique to your book. So this number here is absolutely unique to the Legends of Grimace Ironblood. Now, how do you get that? Well, you need to find the website, which is, I think it's ALCS, and they are responsible for selling the ISBNs, and you can buy them in blocks of 10. I believe they're about £150 in the UK, but you do get a block of 10. So I'm hoping to write 10 books, so that will see me, one a year. So that's for the next 10 years. I think that's pretty good value, and you work it into the cost of obviously the printing and how much it's going to cost you per book. Now the reason why you need that number is it will automatically then go onto Amazon's database, which is a good thing. But then what you need to do is set yourself up as an Amazon seller, and there's pretty clear instructions how to do that. Once you do that, then you can upload your images, because the cover won't be there, obviously, because they've only got it from a database. So I uploaded the cover, and also you can upload other images. So because this book here, my book is actually an illustrated book, as you can see, hopefully. I wanted to show off the illustrations as well, which are very brilliantly drawn by Rich Nen. And therefore I put a few of the illustrations in and a few sample pages so they can read a little bit of the book and get a flavour of what the book's like. So you can do that. You can also fill in the description, so you can put in the sort of the back cover blurb that will hopefully entice the reader into buying your book. And it's a great way because you can also, when people purchase your books, you can also contact the buyer directly. So what I've been doing is saying, hi there, would you like me to sign your copy? If so, who would you like it to sign it to? Nice little personal touch. So I definitely recommend that you put your copy onto Amazon. And it's really simple. Once it's gone on, they do take a small cut, but it's not as big as I thought it was going to be, so that's good news. Doesn't eat into too much of your profit. Plus also they take into postage. You don't really have to work any of the postage out as well. They will work out, you put in the weight of the book and the size of the book, and they would charge the appropriate postage. So they're really, really organised. And the other thing is create a digital version. Now I'm going to be doing that as well. And I do know that Amazon have some software that you can download to help you create that digital software. So if you're not too minded, or you think, I haven't got the right software, Amazon will help you out. And obviously I think their one is Kindle. There are other digital formats as well that you can create for your book. Also have a local book launch. Hopefully you've got a bookshop near you, or even within a half an hour radius. Contact them. Hopefully they'll be receptive. You're a local author, you're a first-time author. They'll be receptive. Invite everybody, make it buzz, make it, a really cool event, have little nibbles and drinks. Invite your friends, family, the local paper, they'll be interested because it's an event, hopefully they'll be interested. And even, why not, if there's a local mayor, invite them along, because that way the press should be there as well. Also try and get your books, and then obviously, hopefully, that local bookshop will take on your book, which leads me on to going to local bookshops as well. Try and make contact with them, ask to come in and see them. Contact them via email first, probably, or on the phone. Arrange a meeting. Don't just necessarily barge in, or if you do barge in, don't expect them to say, yeah, I got free time, because everyone's busy. Go in, talk to them, and if they are, be prepared. Have your copy of your book that you can show them, and also, this is what I've been doing, keeping a box in the car, because they might say, yeah, we'll take 5. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I haven't got 5 on me. You kind of want to close the deal there and then. So just go, yeah, I'll be back in 5 minutes, and you can go and get your books. Also, go for the nationals. Why not? In the UK, Waterstones is probably the biggest chain of bookshops. And that process is interesting. I contacted Waterstones. I went into my local one and they said I needed to contact a certain department, which I did. They were great. They gave me lots of advice. Basically, they only deal with distributors. So you need to get onto the distributor. Now, there are quite a few distributors in the UK. They recommended one, which was Gardeners. And what you do is you contact them. They will then say fill in a form. There was a few questions I didn't quite understand. So I'm going to go back to them and say, sorry, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in this, and I didn't want to get it wrong. So hopefully they'll be kind about that, and they won't laugh at me. I'm sure they won't. Once it's accepted by the distributor, then, and only then, will Waterstones look at it, because it's on their system. Then they will you send a copy to them, they will look at the book, they will consider it. So there's no guarantee that once you're on a distributor that a bookshop will take it. And hopefully, fingers crossed, they will take it, and it will be, throughout the nation, which is what you want. Which also reminds me, they will definitely need an ISBN, which is the number, the unique number on the back of your book, which is why it's another good reason to get one. And they take about 3 or 4 weeks to order. So when you're printing your book, plan that into the whole schedule as well. It's just something I learnt. I did get it done in time, just. Also, there are comic books, which are separate to bookshops, because comic books tend to just go for sci-fi, fantasy and horror. That's the traditional, realms. And they'll be probably maybe a bit more receptive to your book because it's right, if it's fantasy, it's going to be right in their genre, so to speak. And so approach them. And again, be professional, be courteous, don't just think, because it's a comic book, they're going to be a bit slack. They're not, they're businesses, they want to sell books. And hopefully, if they're local to you, they'll want to support local authors as well. And also, we're nearly finished here. Remember, you do need to send, if you've got an ISBN, you do need to send 5 copies to, this is in the UK, to 5 separate libraries. Now, they're called the legal deposit libraries. This is a legal requirement. That's the Trinity College Dublin, the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, the Cambridge University Library, the National Library of Scotland, and also the National Library of Wales. So my book, I've sent them off. My book is in those 5 libraries. How cool is that? That's pretty cool. So yeah, remember you do that, but you will get a letter. If you've got one of those numbers, you will get a letter automatically in that, and they'll tell you where to send it. Also, one last bit of advice, book fairs. Go online, search for book fairs in whatever country you're in. There will be, quite book fairs all over the country, happening all over the year. So it's great. Get yourself a little table. Maybe get yourself a banner made up. I had a banner made up because we launched our book here, my book, at the UK Games Expo. The Bottled Imp had a little stand, and it was really cool because the nice thing about that is you can talk about your book. You can, you're kind of trying to convince people to buy your book, but you don't want to do it in a horrid way. You're not really a businessman, but you're enthusiastic about your own project. If you believe in it, you'll be enthusiastic and passionate, and that really can induce people, to really get, he's really into his book. I'll buy this. It's amazing, just that personal contact, what that can actually have.